All right, Bio 1040 class. Good to see you guys today for our recorded lecture day. Today we're going to start the cardiovascular system. So we just finished up the reproductive systems, and now we're going to move into the cardiovascular system. So today we're going to start with looking at the heart and looking at the anatomy and some of the tissues of the heart, the histology of the heart. So let's dive right in. So whenever we start a new section, I always like to kind of begin with where we've came from in this class and where we're headed. So this is all the stuff that we did last semester, right? That's all the fall, all that stuff, and then we continued this in the spring so far, right? We continued some of the nervous system, endocrine system, reproductive system, and all of these tissues and cells involved in those tissues could not survive for more than a matter of minutes without one thing, right? And what is that thing? It's ATP. That's our energy, right? And the way that we make that ATP is with oxygen. And how do we get oxygen around the body? Well, we gotta get it to travel around the body via the cardiovascular system. And so part of that cardiovascular system is the heart and pumping the blood around the heart, around the body. So it's quite an incredible pump. It pumps about, depending on your size, 1 to 7 gallons per minute of blood. Okay, so that averages around 2,000 gallons a day of pumping. Okay, in a lifetime, that's about 1 million barrels of blood. Okay, so we talk about barrels, we talk about these big 55-gallon drums. Okay, and how much is that? Well, if we look at these giant oil tankers that sail, or not sail, but go across the oceans to take oil from the Middle East over to the US or from the US to other places, they hold about 500,000 barrels of oil. Okay, so our heart pumps enough in our lifetime to fill up 2 of these giant tankers. Look how big it is. They're about the size of the Sears Tower in Chicago. Okay, so just a massive amount of blood that is pumped incredibly by this little tiny, not little tiny, but it's pretty small compared to some of these larger things, pump in our body. Okay, so let's look at the kind of layers of the heart here. So the heart hangs really actually right in the middle of the thoracic cavity, but it's mostly on the left side, and that's just due to the left side of the heart is much bigger. It's not that it's actually more on the left side, it's just the left side of the heart is bigger, so it sticks more over onto our left side. Surrounded by the lungs, sits right on top of the diaphragm, okay, and then it's well protected by the ribs and the sternum. Okay, so one thing I want you to focus in on here is this structure, this membranous structure called the pericardium. Okay, the pericardium has 2 separate layers. There's the fibrous layer, which is on the outside. It's very tough, prevents overexpansion under high pressure. This also anchors the heart to the surrounding structures, so it doesn't move around as much. Okay, and then there's the serous pericardium. Okay, so the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. The serous pericardium is a double-layered membrane. Okay, we talked about those serous membranes some last semester. They always have 2 layers, and then on the inside there's a fluid-filled space. Okay, so we'll take a look at that a little bit closer. Okay, so now of that, so remember of the pericardium, there was a fibrous pericardium and there's a serous pericardium. Okay, so now when we look at a little bit deeper, let's look at what's known as the epicardium. So the epicardium is the heart side of the pericardium. Okay, so it's the inside of this. Okay, so remember that serous pericardium had 2 layers. Okay, it had I didn't say what the 2 layers were yet, but there are 2 layers. So this is the inside of that, the epicardium. Okay, and then between those 2 layers is what's called the pericardial cavity. Okay, and this is a fluid-filled space between those 2 layers of the serous membrane. Okay, and this is a space that can actually get inflamed. And you can get something called pericarditis. If you get inflammation in the fluid in that space, then that can lead to what's known as pericardial friction rub. And in very severe cases, lead to something called cardiac tamponade. Cardiac tamponade is when the heart is just having so much pressure on it because the fluid in that space expands and builds up and squeezes down in the heart. So the heart's trying to pump, but it can't pump against that pressure. And this can be life-threatening. And what can happen is they can actually have to drain that space. So they actually stick a needle in there. Somebody's got to know their anatomy well to know where to put that needle, right? And then they suck that extra fluid out, and that takes the pressure off the heart. So that's the epicardium. okay? Epicardium is the internal part of that serous membrane. The space between the two serous membranes is that pericardial cavity where the fluid is, okay? And then we'll work our way a little bit closer to the heart. This is now the myocardium. This is the actual muscle of the heart. This is what does the pumping, all right? And then there's the endocardium, and this is between the myocardium and the heart, okay, chamber. So this is the most internal layer of the heart. This is epithelial tissue, very thin layer. Okay, so let's take a look at this in diagram format. Pause it for a second and see if you can fill this in if you can. Okay, so here's a kind of a zooming in on this part of the heart right here. Okay, so we can see that so we've got our pericardium, which is this whole external part, and then the myocardium is the muscle tissue there. Okay, so A is that fibrous part of the pericardium. Okay, so that whole layer, and then B is what's known as the parietal part of the serous pericardium. Okay, so we have the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium, right? And that serous pericardium has two layers. So there's the parietal part, that's the part that's away from the heart. Then we got that space in the middle, that's where that fluid is built up and can get built up too much. Okay, and then lastly, we have the epicardium, which is the visceral part or the part closer to the heart, okay, of the serous membrane. So that's right here. Okay, and then we've got the myocardium there in the middle, the heart. And then we've got the endocardium all the way down, and this is where all the blood is in the heart, in the actual chamber of the heart. Okay, so that's an important part of that. So where does fluid build up during pericarditis? That would be this pericardial cavity. All right, so hopefully that makes sense with the layers there. Let's talk about the chambers of the heart a little bit. Okay, we've got the atrium, the atria, and the ventricles. So the atria are kind of the receiving chambers, and that's really what gets blood to the ventricles, okay? And then we have what's known as the interatrial septum, which is this separating wall between the right and the left side, okay? There's a hole in that wall in the fetus, okay? Because there's really no reason for the blood to go to the lungs in the baby, because in the fetus, because the fetus isn't breathing, right? So there's no reason for the blood to go fill up in the lungs. The blood's already filled with oxygen from mom, because you get it from mom. And that mom gives you fully oxygenated blood, okay? So there's a hole that just skips the ventricles completely. It goes right from the right atrium over to the left atrium, then it can go down the left ventricle, get pumped out. So it skips that right ventricle, okay? The auricles are these external portions of the heart, of the atria. You've seen these in the sheep heart at this point already. Okay, and then the ventricles, these are our big pumping chambers, okay? Much thicker, much stronger. There's also a septum there. There's an interventricular septum that separates the left and the right side. Okay, so a little bit of a question to think about. I would encourage you to pause and think about this one a little bit, read this. So you've identified those papillary muscles in the sheep heart already, okay? But what would be the purpose of these things, right? So we see them right here, little muscles sticking up. They're connected to these chordae tendineae, which are connected to the bottom of the flaps of those atrioventricular valves, okay? So remember, blood is coming down from the atria into the ventricles, and that ventricle is going to contract, squeeze that blood out, and it's going to go back out a different way, okay? So think about that for a second and then come back. Okay, so what's the purpose of these things? I like to show this image to think about. Have you ever been in a rainstorm like this, when it gets really windy and your umbrella just flips completely backwards, right? That's kind of what would happen to these valves if you didn't have the papillary muscles and chordae tendineae. Because what happens is they contract, ventricles contract, like we said, that squeezes blood up, right? And if you didn't have those chordae tendineae and those papillary muscles to pull down, that's what keeps this valve from flipping inside out, right? If those weren't there to hold that down while the blood is pushing up against it, that valve would flip inside out, just like the umbrella, okay? So C is our correct answer there. All right, so let's talk about those valves a little bit. We have two main sets of valves, okay? We have the ones between the atria and the ventricles. So on the right side, that one's called the tricuspid valve. On the left side, it's called the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve, okay? Both have what are known as chordae tendineae, just talked about those, connecting those papillary muscles to the valve itself. And then we have valves between the ventricles and whatever associated artery it is that's going to exit the heart. Okay, these are known as the semilunar valves because they have three little leaflets to them. Okay, so the right side, that one's called the pulmonary semilunar valve, or just the pulmonary valve. and then the left side is called the aortic semilunar valve, or just the aortic valve. Okay, so you can have some problems with these valves. You can have a prolapse like this, where it kind of doesn't close all the way. You can have some stenosis, which means stiffening of that valve. Okay, you can also have different versions of incompetence or insufficiency, where it doesn't close all the way and blood's able to go backwards. Okay, in some cases we can actually have a full valve replacement. Mechanical valves or pig valves are commonly used as well. Okay, so what's the function of these heart valves? Okay, so one thing we need to kind of think about here is what causes these valves to close versus what causes them to open. Okay, so let's talk about those AV valves first. Okay, so we're talking about blood. We're talking about these ones here, right? So the tricuspid and the bicuspid. Okay, so what happens is when these ventricles contract, blood pushes up underneath these and slops them shut. Okay, and then that makes the blood go the other way, right? It goes out the vessel instead. So what we'll say with the AV valves causing those to close is the ventricular contraction. Okay, what causes them to open? Well, what causes them to open is when blood is rushing down, and we can see it here, when blood rushes down this way and the heart's not contracting. So really it's when pressure in the atria is greater than pressure in the ventricles. Okay, so that would be when the heart's relaxing and blood's filling in the atria, so that creates pressure and it opens up those AV valves. Okay, what about the semilunar valves? So those are the ones up here, the ones leaving the heart, right? We got the two there. Okay, so what causes them to close? Well, let's start with what causes them to open. They open up when the pressure inside the ventricle exceeds the pressure on the outside. Okay, so pressure in ventricle becomes greater than pressure outside. Okay, and what causes them to close is just the opposite. So this definitely happens during contraction of the ventricles, right? But the higher the pressure is on the other side of that valve, like the higher your blood pressure is, the harder it is to open up that valve and get the blood to leave. Okay, so what causes those valves to close? Well, it's just the opposite of this, right? When the pressure in the ventricle becomes less than pressure outside. As soon as that happens, so blood's rushing out of that aorta, coming back, rushing, because there's a lot of pressure by the ventricle. As soon as that ventricle starts relaxing, now the pressure in the ventricles drops lower than the pressure out there in the body, out in the aorta. So the blood just makes a U-turn and comes right back towards the heart, right? And when it does that, it comes back towards the heart this way, slaps those shut, and that's what causes the closing. Okay, and it's really the closing of those two valves that are our heart sound, so the lub and the dub. Okay, the lub is the closing of the AV valves, the dub is the closing of the semilunar valves. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, and this diagram kind of gets at that. We won't dive into this too deeply at all, but what causes the aortic valve to open? We'll see this one shows aortic pressure, and it shows ventricular pressure. And that's what I was just saying, that when the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the aorta is when it opens, right? That's right here, okay? So when it gets up above that, and then what causes it to close, okay, I'm gonna put that right there. What causes the aortic valve to close is when that pressure dips down below, so that's right there. Okay, and that's just a little diagram to help you understand it. We won't go into too much detail about the Wiggers diagram in this class, but it is a nice way to understand it. If you want to dive into that a little more, it's in the book. Okay, so let's talk about some more structures of the heart here. So labeling of the heart, okay? So we can see, this is just kind of a different view of those valves of the heart, okay? And which valve is between the right atrium and the ventricle, okay? So remember that one on the right side is the tricuspid valve. Right, so tricuspid, so that one is going to be B, okay? We can see A is the mitral valve, B is the tricuspid valve, C is the aortic valve. The only way you can tell there is because of the color, it's red, but also because it is closer to the other ones, and then the pulmonary valve is blue. And we can see that foramen valve right there, also known as a fossa ovalis. That's that shortcut that the blood can take from one side of the heart to the other to skip going to the lungs. All right, so what about the heart muscle itself, right? The heart muscle itself needs blood too, right? The heart does all of its work pumping blood outside of itself, but how does the heart muscle itself get blood? Because it needs oxygen and it needs to make ATP too. Well, the myocardium is too thick for oxygen to just go straight through from the chamber. So we have special coronary arteries that come right off of the aorta, right? So the blood's just exiting the heart right here. Before it even gets up to this curved part, we got these coronary arteries that come off and feed the heart. So the heart's really the first one to get the blood. Okay, and we can see the right coronary artery there, left coronary artery there. Okay, so, and then that's how it gets delivered, and then how it comes back are these coronary veins and the coronary sinus that dumps blood back into the vena cava and back into the right atrium. Okay, so some pathologies we can have with the coronary arteries. These are the most common things in our country that kill us, really. So angina is a temporary blockage of one of these coronary arteries that leads to chest pain. That's what angina is. Okay, causes can be stress-induced spasms to the arteries. It can also be more likely coronary artery disease or atherosclerosis. We'll talk more about that at the end of the semester. The way this is dealt with is something called nitroglycerin. It's a little pill you take, put it on your tongue. It's that same substance we talked about with erectile dysfunction, which is nitric oxide. It vasodilates, opens up those blood vessels, so it gets more oxygen to that heart muscle that's not doing well, and drops your pain. Okay, myocardial infarction, or MI, is a heart attack. This is the #1 cause of death in our country. One person dies every 40 seconds of this in the US. Okay, so what this is a complete blockage, whereas this was a partial or temporary temporary or partial blockage. This one is a complete blockage, and it leads to some of the heart muscle actually dying, and it doesn't heal well. So what happens? This is caused by atherosclerosis, blockage, and then could be a blood clot. And the treatment for this is to bypass that blocked part, or to put in a little thing called a stent that goes in there and opens up the blood vessel. There's a picture of it on this side. This is what a stent looks like up here. Right, so put a little mesh in, it opens up and allows blood to flow through. And then we can also do bypass surgeries, where let's say the blockage was right here. All right, so we can take a vein, connect it to one of the large arteries there, skip that blocked part, and then feed the vessels underneath it. That's what a bypass surgery is. It can be single, double, triple, quadruple, depending on how many places need to be bypassed. You can see the 2 there, 3, 2 here, and 4 on the last one. Okay, so what about the heart muscle cells themselves, and what do they look like? Okay, so they are striated, similar to skeletal muscle. Okay, they're also branched, which means they're all connected. They have a single nucleus, much smaller cells than skeletal muscle cells, but way more mitochondria than skeletal muscle. 30% of the volume of these cells is skeletal muscle versus 2% of the volume in skeletal muscle cells. So they're very highly resistant to fatigue, which is good. We don't want our heart getting tired, right? Have these special structures called intercalated discs between the cells, which contain desmosomes and gap junctions. Desmosomes hold the cells together. If you remember, those are rivet-like structures last semester, and gap junctions allow for ions to pass from cell to cell. So the action potentials just go one to the next, okay? And so they can act in something called functional syncytium, which means all the fibers act as one unit, and that all the left ventricle contract all at once, not a little bit of it and a little bit of it, a little bit of it. We want all of it to contract at once, okay? This is all involuntarily controlled, which is different than skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system does that, okay? So we look at the diagram, kind of filling in what was on the previous slide. We can see these structures. I encourage you to pause it, fill this in, and see if you can answer this question. Okay, which structure is responsible for allowing action potentials to penetrate deep into the cell and stimulate the sarcoplasmic reticulum? It wasn't one of the ones on the previous slide, but it's one we talked about previously. But we'll get there in a sec. So A is those gap junctions. B is those desmosomes. Those are 2 things in those intercalated discs. C are the mitochondria. Right? D is the nucleus of the cells. E is a T-tubule, and that was the answer to this question here. Okay. F is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's what holds onto the calcium for us. Okay. Sarcolemma is just the membrane, and then H are those intercalated discs that contain these 2. Okay. So those are the structures you need to know there. This is just kind of the pathway of blood through the heart. So I do want you to understand the different steps that it takes. Okay, so fill in what's happening with each step. Okay, so it's going to come back in, start in the vena cava, go into the right atrium, right? And it's going to go right ventricle here, and then it's going to pump out to the lungs, right? Out the right ventricle. Then it's going to come back in those aorta or those pulmonary veins into the left atrium, down to the left ventricle, out the left ventricle, out the aorta, right? And out to the body. Okay, so you can fill that in, take some time with that, make sure you understand that. And then lastly, the last part here, the pulmonary circuit versus the systemic circuit. So the pulmonary circuit is the part that goes to the lungs, right? And this is a low pressure system. Don't create much pressure there because it doesn't have to go very far, okay? You can keep track of that pathway there. And then the systemic side, much higher pressure, much farther to go. And you can see that pathway there. All right, guys, that's all we got here for today. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you next week.